Imagine a city destined for destruction, a place where warnings of doom are dismissed and false hopes reign. One man, Jeremiah, stood as the last voice of reason, a prophet burdened with the knowledge of an unstoppable catastrophe. His tears were not for himself, but for a people too blinded by pride to see the ruin ahead. This is not just a tale of a city's fall. It's a story of ignored prophecy, divine judgment, and the collapse of a kingdom that thought itself untouchable. What happens when the final warning is ignored? The answer is written in the ashes of Jerusalem. Jeremiah, often known as the weeping prophet, occupies a unique place among the great prophets of the Bible. His prophetic ministry, spanning more than 40 years, was marked by an unrelenting message of judgment for Judah and Jerusalem, combined with a deep compassion for the people who scorned his words. His weeping was not a sign of weakness, but rather a reflection of his heartache over a nation that had forsaken its covenant with God. Suffering, rejection, and loneliness characterized Jeremiah's life. At an early age, as Judah's monarchy was rapidly collapsing, he was called to prophecy. He began by issuing a warning stating that the people's continued disobedience to God's law, injustice, and idolatry would bring about their destruction. Even though Jeremiah's predictions were clearly fulfilled, the ecclesiastical and political establishment of his day opposed him. Because he told the truth that others would not hear, he was beaten, imprisoned, and called a traitor. Jeremiah's weeping was not just for the physical destruction of the city he loved, but for the spiritual decay that had made that destruction inevitable. He understood that the fall of Jerusalem would not be the result of Babylonian military might, but of divine judgment, a judgment that could have been averted had the people heeded the call to repentance. But as is often the case with prophets, Jeremiah's words were ignored, and he lived to see the very disaster he had spent his life trying to prevent. Visions of the impending devastation were abundant in Jeremiah's predictions. He warned of the coming calamities that would overtake Judah if they did not come back to God, including the sword, scarcity, and pestilence. "I will turn this city into a wasteland and a source of hissing. Everyone who sees it will be appalled by its calamities and will sigh." What he said was clear and concise, not enigmatic or technical. There was no doubt in the message. Jerusalem would collapse if the people did not turn to God. Yet despite the urgency of his message, Jeremiah's warnings were largely dismissed. The people of Judah had grown complacent, convinced that their status as God's chosen people and the presence of the temple in Jerusalem would shield them from harm. They believed that as long as the temple stood, they were safe, regardless of their behavior. This false sense of security was reinforced by false prophets, who contradicted Jeremiah's message by promising peace and prosperity. These prophets, eager to maintain their favor with the ruling class, assured the people that no harm would come to Jerusalem. "Peace, peace," they cried, "when there is no peace." Jeremiah chapter 6, verse 14. Jeremiah, however, stood alone in his insistence that the people's moral and spiritual corruption would bring about their downfall. He warned that their reliance on external religious symbols, like the temple, was meaningless without true obedience to God's commands. The people had become experts in the rituals of worship, but had lost sight of the heart of their faith: justice, mercy, and humility before God. The prophet Micah had asked, "What does the Lord require of you but to do justice and to love kindness and to walk humbly with your God?" Micah chapter 6, verse 8. Jeremiah's message echoed this, but it fell on deaf ears. Even Judah's king, Zedekiah, was complicit in ignoring Jeremiah's counsel. Although Zedekiah occasionally sought Jeremiah's advice in secret, he lacked the courage to follow it. Publicly, he wavered between rebellion against Babylon and alliances with Egypt, ignoring Jeremiah's plea to surrender to Babylon as God's will for Judah's survival. Zedekiah's refusal to heed Jeremiah's warning sealed the fate of Jerusalem. The fall of Jerusalem in 587 BCE was not simply a military defeat. It was the culmination of years of prophetic warning, now fulfilled. Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had laid siege to the city for nearly 2 years. As the Babylonian army surrounded Jerusalem, the people inside were trapped. Supplies of food and water dwindled, and the people began to starve. Jeremiah had foreseen this siege, describing in terrifying detail the famine that would grip the city. The children beg for bread, but no one gives it to them. The suffering inside the city was unimaginable. Hunger and desperation drove people to unspeakable acts. Jeremiah's prophecy of cannibalism was horrifyingly realized. With their own hands, compassionate women have cooked their own children who became their food when my people were destroyed. Lamentations, chapter 4, verse 10. The city's inhabitants, once so proud and defiant, were reduced to utter hopelessness. Throughout this time, Jeremiah continued to call for surrender. He pleaded with King Zedekiah to open the gates to the Babylonians, insisting that surrender would spare the city from total destruction. But Zedekiah, driven by pride and the influence of his advisors, refused. He hoped for a miraculous intervention or a rescue from Egypt, both of which Jeremiah had already prophesied would fail. In his final hours, Zedekiah tried to flee the city under the cover of darkness, but he was captured by Babylonian forces. As punishment, he was forced to watch his sons be executed before his eyes were gouged out. And he was taken in chains to Babylon, a tragic end to a king who could have prevented the downfall of his city. The Babylonians breached the walls of Jerusalem, and the city fell. Nebuchadnezzar's forces set fire to the city, including the temple, which had been the center of Jewish worship for centuries. The destruction of the temple was not only a physical loss, but a spiritual one. The very heart of Judah's identity and relationship with God was now in ruins. The Ark of the Covenant, which had been housed in the temple's innermost sanctuary, was lost to history, and the people of Judah were left without their most sacred symbol of God's presence. The fall of Jerusalem was a devastating confirmation of Jeremiah's prophecies. The city's leaders, its priests, and its people had all ignored the warnings of God's prophet, and now they faced the consequences. What had once been unthinkable, the destruction of the city of David and Solomon's temple, was now a bitter reality. In the aftermath of the destruction, Jeremiah walked through the ruins of Jerusalem, heartbroken and grief-stricken. His lament is captured in the book of Lamentations, where his sorrow over the fallen city is laid bare. How deserted lies the city, once so full of people. How like a widow is she, who once was great among the nations. Lamentations. Chapter 1, verse 1. Jeremiah's grief was not just for the physical loss of the city, but for the spiritual failure that had led to its downfall. Jeremiah's lament is a profound expression of both sorrow and faith. He does not shy away from the reality of Judah's sins or the justice of God's judgment. The Lord is righteous, yet I rebelled against his command. Lamentations, chapter 1, verse 18. Yet even in the midst of his mourning, Jeremiah finds hope. Because of the Lord's great love, we are not consumed, for his compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. Lamentations, chapter 3, verse 22 to 23. Even as he mourns the devastation, Jeremiah recognizes that God's judgment is not the end. There is still room for repentance, still hope for restoration. His lament is both a cry of anguish and a declaration of faith in God's mercy. Jeremiah knew that the destruction of Jerusalem, while devastating, was not the final chapter in God's story with his people. Beyond the ruins lay the possibility of renewal, if only the people would turn back to God. Deep spiritual lessons that are still relevant now can be learned from the account of Jeremiah and the fall of Jerusalem. The significance of keeping one's word is central to Jeremiah's message. A covenant, an arrangement requiring adherence to God's commands and ways, formed the foundation of God's relationship with his people. God's protection was withheld from the people of Judah when they disregarded that covenant. Jerusalem's destruction served as a reminder that God's promises are conditional and demand our involvement and dedication. Another key lesson from Jeremiah's warning is the danger of spiritual complacency. The people of Judah believed that because they had the temple and the city of Jerusalem, they were immune to judgment. They placed their trust in outward symbols rather than in true repentance and obedience. Jeremiah's message was a stark reminder that no external symbol, no matter how sacred, can substitute for a heart that is right with God. Jeremiah's life also teaches us about the cost of speaking the truth. Throughout his ministry, Jeremiah was rejected, persecuted, and even imprisoned. Yet he never wavered in his commitment to proclaiming God's message, no matter the personal cost. His courage and integrity stand as a powerful example for all who are called to speak difficult truths in the face of opposition. Finally, Jeremiah's lament offers a profound lesson in faith. Even in the darkest moments, when it seemed that all was lost, Jeremiah held on to the belief that God's mercy would ultimately prevail. His lament was not a cry of despair, but a statement of faith in God's unfailing compassion. For Jeremiah, the destruction of Jerusalem was not the end, but a call to repentance and renewal.